borders, including the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons and the Special Rapporteur on trafficking in persons. The gravity of the situation demands urgent and sustained international engagement. The people of the DRC cannot afford further inaction. They need immediate relief, protection, and a path towards sustainable peace, inclusive development, and justice. As reaffirmed by the Pact for the Future, sustainable development, peace and security, and human rights are interlinked and mutually reinforcing pillars of the United Nations. We cannot have one without the others. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je vous remercie de votre déclaration.
Yes, thank you for your statement, Your Excellency. We're waiting for Ms. Bintou Keita to arrive. She's the Special Representative of the Secretary General in the Democratic Republic of Congo and head of the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the country. She's just arrived at Geneva Airport, and as soon as she gets here, I will give her the floor. In line with our habitual practice, I will give the floor now to the representatives of the concerned countries. So I will give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Patrick Muyaya Katembwe, Minister of Communication and Media of the Democratic Republic of Congo, for his statement on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Congo as a concerned country. Excellency, Minister, you have the floor for 5 minutes. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Human Rights Council, the Democratic Republic of Congo expresses its deep gratitude to the Human Rights Council for holding this special session, which has been co-sponsored by over 30 member states and 22 observer states. This meeting is a response to the urgent situation of mass human rights violations and attacks on civilians in North and South Kivu, which are the result of attacks and offensives by the Rwandan Defence Forces and their M23 and AFC proxies. Indiscriminate bombing against IDP camps and populated areas have compounded a catastrophic humanitarian situation. These attacks have deliberately targeted vulnerable people, which is a flagrant violation of the principles of humanity, distinction, precaution, proportionality, and preventing unnecessary suffering. The Rwanda Defence Forces and their proxies have transformed areas of shelter into military targets, imperiling the lives of thousands of innocent people, including women and children. In Goma, where there is no water or electricity, the principles of international humanitarian laws have been systematically violated. There's been indiscriminate bombing against residential areas, causing mass displacement of people, and there have been attacks against IDP camps. This is particularly alarming because people are already very vulnerable, and they have been trapped between the Rwandan forces and their M23 proxies, have also been supported by foreign actors. According to the UN, the offensive which led to the occupation of Goma, at least 3,000 people were killed and a further 3,000 were wounded. Attacks against civilians and the forced displacement of people and attacks against IDP camps reflect unacceptable brutality, which is compounded by unspeakable atrocities, notably murders, the rape of at least 200 women, massacres, forced conscription of children taken to Rutshuru training camps and others. By actively supporting the armed groups, Rwanda is directly responsible for the violations, which has exposed civilians to unspeakable suffering. Peacekeeping forces with the Security Council mandate, particularly MONUSCO, as well as humanitarian facilities, have been targeted on a number of occasions. This has undermined their ability to protect civilians in a hostile environment. We also deplore the attacks against the SADC regional forces, which have been working tirelessly for regional stability. President, in view of this situation, the Democratic Republic of Congo calls for the establishment of an international commission of inquiry to examine human rights violations committed in my country. This commission must have a mandate to establish the truth as to who is responsible for these crimes and to provide recommendations for holding them accountable. We also call for tangible measures to be adopted to prevent future violations of this nature. It's vital that we strengthen monitoring and early warning mechanisms and to ensure better coordination between MONUSCO, Congolese security forces and regional actors in order to protect civilians and prevent further escalations of violence. Furthermore, it's vital today that we ensure immediate and unfettered humanitarian access in order to better care for the thousands of injured, evacuate the most seriously injured and reduce the risk of the spread of epidemics such as cholera and mpox in a city which has already been traumatized and where corpses litter many streets. We firmly reject the involvement of certain states, particularly Rwanda. They've provided logistical, military and financial support to armed groups operating on our territory. Rwanda's support for M23, which has been documented on a number of occasions, including by the UN Security Council group of experts, has stoked violence in the east of our country for over 30 years, compounding the war for reasons linked to the exploitation of Congo's strategic mineral resources. We call upon the Council to hold Rwanda accountable for its war crimes and crimes against humanity, particularly the forced displacement of people and their replacement by others, as well as by appointing new administrative authorities with a view to permanently occupying these territories. It's vital that international pressure be applied to Rwanda so that it immediately puts a stop to its support for the armed groups and immediately withdraws from Congolese territory. President, the Democratic Republic of Congo remains steadfastly committed to searching for peace and stability. We reiterate that we stand ready to work constructively with all regional and international actors, but it's absolutely vital the international community firmly supports our efforts to put a stop to this crisis and to put an end to the suffering of our people living in the east of our country. Thus, we reiterate our call for Rwanda to act responsibly and take immediate measures to put a stop to its support to armed groups. A consensual adoption of the resolution would be a sign of solidarity for the millions of Congolese people living under Rwandan occupation today. I thank you for your attention, President. Thank you. I'd like to thank you for your statement, and I would now like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda for his statement as a concerned country. Excellency, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to start by thanking the High Commissioner for the oral statement on the situation in the Eastern DRC, which persistently constitutes a security threat to the Great Lakes region and to Rwanda in particular. The current session is called for at a time when the situation in the Eastern DRC is evolving rapidly. The Eastern African Community Summit of 29th January and the South African Development Summit of 31st January 25 have convened a summit to discuss today and tomorrow with a view to holding a frank discussion on this crisis and in the hope of finding a lasting solution to a crisis. Therefore, we should give a chance to this important regional initiative to bear fruits before preempting their outcome and attempting to feed the ongoing discussions in the relevant UN bodies. This reminds us of the fate of the EAC regional force that made stride in imposing ceasefire and accompanying the peace process from March to September 2023, during which the M23 relinquished 8% of the territory it was previously holding. But before this process could be completed, the DRC unilaterally decided to expel the force, replacing it with the SAMI-DRC with an offensive mandate in the pursuit of a military solution. Rwanda raised concerns about the substitution of the EAC force, a true peacekeeping force, with the SAMI-DRC, an offensive force. SAMI-DRC is now part of the Kinshasa-led military coalition, which includes the UN-sanctioned genocidal militia FDLR, Burundi forces, European mercenaries, Wazalendo with logistical and operational support by the UN. Those concerns are now proven right as we unfortunately witnessed the result of imposing a military solution to a political problem. Mr. President, these root causes, we shall repeat time and again, are on the one hand, the preservation of the FDLR, a group that committed genocide in Rwanda in 1994, fled to the DRC, where they now pose an existential threat to our security, and continue spreading their genocidal ideology. On the other hand, the marginalization of Kinyarwanda-speaking Congolese community, particularly Tutsi, by the government of DRC. Everyone here in this session recalls the Congolese citizens were abominably massacred, lynched, banned, and cannibalized for looking Tutsi. Yet there was no urgent meeting or a special session on this issue. There was no condemnation of the DRC top leadership who used hate speech for electoral purposes and justified the persecution of a portion of its own citizens. Furthermore, there was no special session of this council when in April 2024, the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Ms. Alice Wairumu-Nderuti, warned about the risk factors for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in the Eastern DRC. Mr. President, we categorically oppose the DRC attempts to portraying Rwanda as being responsible for the instability in the Eastern DRC. It is a well-known deflection tactic used to escape being accountable for the atrocities Kinshasa and its allied armed group are inflicting on their own citizens. What is clear, however, is the imminent threat the current situation poses to Rwanda. Following the fall of Goma, new evidence has come in light regarding an imminent large-scale attack against Rwanda. The Kinshasa-backed coalition has stockpiled a large number of weapons and military equipment near Rwanda's border, mostly in or around the Goma airport. These weapons include rockets, kamikaze drones, heavy artillery guns capable to shoot precisely within the Rwandan territory. The weapons were not turned at the theater of operations against the M23. Rather, they were pointed directly at Rwanda. I would like to recall that on January 26, 2025, retreating DRC forces fired at Rwanda, causing tragic loss of 16 Rwandan lives and injury of 161 civilians. These shelling were deliberate.
Excellency, I ask you to come to the conclusion of your statement.
They could strongly be condemned. Rwanda will not wait for the threat to materialize, and this is why our country maintains proportional, punctual, and dynamic measures to the border to prevent any spillover of this kind and respond appropriately.
Thank you for your declaration.
With regard
Je donne maintenant la parole à Madame Bintou Keita.
I now give the floor to Ms. Bintou Keita, Special Representative of the Secretary General for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the representative of MONUSCO. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President of the Human Rights Council, Minister of Communication of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madam Minister for Human Rights, Madam Minister for Foreign Trade, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, Vice Minister of National Affairs, High Commissioner, distinguished members of the Human Rights Council. I thank you for this emergency session on this extremely troubling situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I would first and foremost express my condolences to the government and the people of the Congolese people who have been victims of this conflict for 30 years and who continue to live in fear. My thoughts also go to the blue helmets and their families who have lost lives, and my thoughts go to those who were injured as well. I welcome those who work with commitment towards a lasting peace in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I would also like to condemn the attacks and pillaging against the UN on the 27th of September. I welcome the efforts of the government to bring perpetrators to justice and to prevent any further incidents of this nature. Mr. President, we have witnessed an unprecedented advance of the M23 and the Rwandan forces. The taking of the city of Goma on the 27th of January were preceded by violent clashes by the between
speak on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries. And let me start by thanking the High Commissioner and the Special Representative for their clear and compelling briefings. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned about the escalating violence in eastern DRC. We urge the M23 to stop its advance and withdraw immediately. We reiterate that Rwanda must cease its support for the M23 and withdraw its armed forces. We strongly condemn Rwanda's military presence in the DRC as a clear violation of international law, the UN Charter, and the territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we continue to urge the DRC to cease its cooperation with the FDLR. We are alarmed by reports of widespread violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law by multiple actors, including sexual and gender-based violence, the recruitment and use of child soldiers, and extrajudicial executions. The offensive has deepened the already disastrous humanitarian crisis in eastern DRC. The risk of large numbers of IDPs being caught between the conflicting parties is deeply worrying. All sides must prioritize protection of civilians, ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access, and fully respect their obligations under international law, including human rights law and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we call for all perpetrators of atrocity crimes to be held accountable. Impunity must not be allowed. We commend the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC's renewed investigative efforts in the DRC, with a priority focus given to any alleged Rome Statute crimes occurring in eastern DRC since January 2022. We fully support the work of the High Commissioner, as well as the team of international experts on the DRC, whose mandate was renewed at the 57th regular session of the Human Rights Council. In conclusion, Mr. President, we call for a quick resumption of political dialogue and negotiations in the Luanda process, and also reiterate our support to the Nairobi process. We support the need to investigate and document all human rights abuses and violations in Eastern Congo and identify those responsible. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Moldova and Ukraine align themselves with this statement. For decades, the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo has witnessed instability as well as human rights violations and abuses. The root causes and drivers are complex, multi-layered and interlinked. Over the past few weeks, the situation has escalated and led to thousands of deaths and wounded and forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of Congolese civilians. Reports of grave violations and abuses of human rights, including summary executions, demand our immediate attention. In particular, the European Union is abhorred by reports of a dramatic increase in cases of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. Furthermore, the recently deadly attacks on peacekeepers whose aim is to protect the civilian population are utterly intolerable and may constitute grave violations of international law. The European Union condemns in the strongest terms the offensive of the M23 supported by the Rwandan armed forces in eastern DRC that led to the occupations of large parts of Congolese territory in North and South Kivu, including the city of Goma. The EU urges the M23 to stop its advance and withdraw immediately. The EU also strongly condemns Rwanda's military presence in the DRC as a clear violation of international law, the UN Charter, and the territorial integrity of the DRC. We call on the Rwandan government to respect the territorial integrity of the DRC by immediately withdrawing all troops from the territory of the DRC and end all forms of support for M23 and other non-state armed groups. The EU also continues to urge the DRC to cease cooperation with the FDLR and other armed groups and take a decisive stance against hate speech. We call upon all parties to re-engage in negotiations and be open for inclusive talks with all. We also call upon all parties to respect international law and to honor their commitments made under the Luanda and Nairobi process. Mr. President, this Council cannot stand idle when international human rights law is being disregarded once again in Eastern DRC. All accusations of violations and abuses need to be thoroughly investigated, victims recognized and supported, and all perpetrators need to be held accountable for all their crimes. We therefore support the resolution put forward by the DRC requesting the establishment of an independent fact-finding mission to investigate and document all when international human rights law is being disregarded once again in Eastern DRC. All accusations of violations and abuses need to be thoroughly investigated, victims recognized and supported, and all perpetrators need to be held accountable for all their crimes. We therefore support the resolution put forward by the DRC requesting the establishment of an independent fact-finding mission to investigate and document all violations and abuses of human rights in Eastern DRC and identify all those responsible.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Morocco. Thank you, President High Commissioner. My delegation would like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of the friendly and brotherly country of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we share with that country the feeling of solidarity, compassion and support given the alarming humanitarian situation in the country. Given the humanitarian crisis and the risk for the territorial integrity, it is essential to address these issues, and this means that through this session we are holding today, we need to address the underlying issues. So we welcome the resolution of the Security Council on the DRC, as well as the praiseworthy role of the Blue Helmets in this country, of which the Moroccan contingent is a key component, working towards ensuring the stability of this brotherly people. The role of the Blue Helmets remains essential, despite the crisis situation which is developing, as we can see today. My delegation would also like to highlight the role of the High Commissioner and his teams on the ground in attempting to analyze the massive violations that are taking place and establish major evidence for the Council. This extraordinary session of the Human Rights Council is being held, let us recall this, at the request of the concerned country, and is the most appropriate framework to address the human rights violations established by the Human Rights Council in the east of the country, which have already led to all forms of violence against civilians, including women and children. Given the crisis situation regarding human rights in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as the consequence of the conflict taking place, the effectiveness of any action of the Council will be crucial to move forward and face this crisis and allow for all those involved to take action. My government has been firm in this position. As to the destabilizing role of the armed groups, which must be condemned in the strongest terms, we express our will to achieve a lasting peace in the DRC. We hope that this extraordinary session can help us in that, with the diplomatic efforts underway, which were referred to this morning as well. We hope that we will be able to achieve this aim following a 30-year crisis which is plaguing the international community and which makes it imperative for it to act, as well as this Council. Thank you.
To the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. We stand at the critical juncture in the east of our continent. The ongoing crisis in DRC poses an existential threat to the peace and security of an already fragile region, demanding our immediate attention. The humanitarian situation in the DRC has reached catastrophic proportions, creating a spillover effect within the region. Reports of widespread human rights abuses, including gender-based violence and severe protectionist incidents, are deeply alarming. We call for the immediate restoration of essential services, including internet services, to alleviate the sufferings of the Goma's population. As the current chair of EAC and a long-standing advocate for peace in the region, Kenya is deeply invested in fostering dialogue and cooperation amongst our members. Guided by the mantra, African Solutions for African Challenges, we welcome the ongoing peace efforts, including the Nairobi and the Rwanda processes. The upcoming joint EAC and SADC summit presents a critical opportunity for dialogue, and we believe any action taken by this Council should complement these efforts. It is imperative that our deliberations and outcomes today do not inadvertently undermine the forthcoming summit, but rather contribute towards the broader regional framework for peace and stability in the DRC. To this end, we urge all stakeholders to reject divisive rhetorics and join call for immediate cessation of hostilities and return to a negotiating table. We remain committed to working with all parties to achieve a lasting, peaceful resolution that respects sovereignty and territorial integrity of DRC, while addressing the legitimate security concern of all states in the region. The situation in Eastern DRC is not merely a localized conflict, but a manifestation of historic challenges intertwined with the legacy of colonialism, wanton and illicit resource extraction, political fragmentation, and intercommunal divisions, which must be addressed. These deep-rooted injustices have undermined governance, fueled conflicts, and human suffering. We urge this Council to take concrete steps in addressing human rights situations in DRC as a testament of our collective resolve as a national community to shape a just and peaceful world. I thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole au distingué.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
President,
the deterioration of the situation has made this special session of the Council essential, where the heads of state are meeting. This Council must address the challenges that is covered by its mandate. The situation in North Kivu is alarming. For many years, France has been mobilized and has called for the mobilization of the international community to face this. The offensive launched by the M23 with the support of Rwanda has had devastating effects for a vulnerable situation, and the reminder of the High Commissioner and the Secretary General and their reports have shed clear light on the cruel situation. The M23 must immediately withdraw from the territories of which it has taken control. We call for dialogue and support the Luanda and Nairobi processes. We call on commitments to be upheld, withdrawal from the Congolese territory, and an addressing of the violation of human rights and international humanitarian by the FDLR and other armed forces. We must return to the negotiating table, ensure the protection of civilians, and uphold human rights. All efforts must be taken to put an end to the humanitarian disaster. We express our support to the United Nations and the international community as a whole in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Safe conditions must be provided for humanitarian actors to provide assistance in safety to civilians. Violence against civilians must stop. Collective rapes of women in Goma at the prison on the 27th of January, if confirmed, may constitute a war crime, just as the MONUSCO must ensure the protection of the civilians. Crimes of that nature cannot remain unpunished. France thanks the team of experts for its work, and we call for an adoption by consensus of a resolution to strengthen its mandate and the urgent establishment of a fact-finding mission on the serious violations against human rights and international humanitarian law in North Kivu and the remainder of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We thank the Minister of Communication of the DRC, and we reiterate our call for solidarity with the Congolese people and the upholding of the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of her country. Thank you.
Distinguished representative of North Macedonia.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, North Macedonia expresses deep concern over the dire and deteriorating human rights situation in the eastern part of the DRC, particularly in North and South Kivu. The recent escalation of hostilities has resulted in severe human rights violations, including attacks on civilians, widespread conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, and forced displacement. We strongly condemn all actions of the armed groups responsible for these atrocities and any parties complicit in perpetuating this violence. The deliberate targeting of vulnerable groups, women, children, and internally displaced persons flagrantly violates international human rights and humanitarian law. The humanitarian impact of this crisis is grave and demands urgent actions. Therefore, we urge all parties to immediately cease hostilities, protect civilians, and uphold human rights obligations. Attacks on peacekeeping personnel and diplomatic community are inexcusable. We call for thorough investigations to ensure accountability for committed human rights abuses. Furthermore, the international community must strengthen its support for peacekeeping operations and humanitarian assistance. A sustainable solution demands coordinated efforts, including dialogue, reconciliation, and development initiatives that foster stability and social cohesion. North Macedonia stands in solidarity with the Congolese people and reaffirms its unwavering commitment to human rights, peace, and security in the region. We fully support the urgent establishment of an independent fact-finding mission to investigate serious human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law committed in North and South Kivu, in the eastern part of the DRC. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Spain endorses the European Union's statement. We welcome the holding of this special session in view of the serious situation. My country vehemently condemns the recent offensive in eastern DRC by the M23 rebel group supported by Rwanda. This is a flagrant violation of international law. This has caused a humanitarian crisis and increased the risk of a large-scale regional war. Spain denounces serious human rights violations occurring in the context of this escalating violence, particularly summary execution, forced conscription of children, sexual and gender-based violence and forced displacement of hundreds of thousands, as has been set out by the High Commissioner and the Special Representative. We urge all those involved in the conflict to respect human rights, international humanitarian, and ensure that civilians have full access to humanitarian aid and that the Luanda and Nairobi processes be resumed. We urge Rwanda to respect the DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity and halt any support to the M23 and withdraw from the DRC's territory. Spain supports the DRC's draft resolution calling for the establishment of an independent mission to document and investigate serious human rights violations and those of international humanitarian law committed in South and North Kivu since the start of 2022. This decision will strengthen already existing cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner. As members of the Council, it's our responsible to take the measures to prevent any further deterioration of the situation. We also think that the call from the International Criminal Court is particularly important, today especially. Accountability is a key to ensuring justice and reparation for the population, which is just exhausted after decades of suffering. The Council is sending a clear message today of its belief in a rules-based international order grounded in respect for human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, colleagues, the list of speakers is now closed, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, Ghana conveys its appreciation to the Presidency for swiftly convening the special session of the Council. We also thank the High Commissioner and other briefers for the informative briefing on the prevailing human rights, security, and humanitarian situation in Eastern DRC. My delegation is gravely concerned about the unfolding crisis and the widespread violence, mostly affecting civilians in the region of North and South Kivu. We regret very much the indiscriminate military attacks and the ongoing violation of the international humanitarian law and human rights law. We are further saddened by the loss of lives of UN peacekeepers who have had to pay the ultimate sacrifice and express our condolences to their families and governments. We strongly support the passionate calls for the end of all forms of violence against civilian population made by the Secretary General of the United Nations, the African Union Peace and Security Council, and recently by the Southern African Development Community. We further underline the need for accountability for all atrocities committed against civilians. Mr. President, the recurring instability in Goma is likely to plunge the DRC and the entire region into dire political, economic, social, and human rights and humanitarian crisis. The sheer number of internally displaced persons will not only pose significant security and humanitarian risk, but would draw the region back on the socio-economic gains made over the years. Ghana appeals to the humanitarian community to rally immediate support for the protection of the population, particularly the vulnerable section of the population, notably women and children. Ghana further calls for the immediate halt to the military hostilities and de-escalation of the mounting tensions. We address our call to all armed groups to lay down their weapons and withdraw from the sovereign territory of DRC. All actors, both state and non-state, have a duty to respect the Charter of the United Nations and its principles, which serves as a bedrock of the international system, including the obligation to settle disputes through peaceful means. In this context, we urge all the armed actors participating in the ongoing conflict to submit to dialogue, which remain crucial to restoring peace, stability to Eastern DRC. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate Ghana's respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC and to contribute meaningfully to the ongoing...
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, Germany aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. Germany firmly condemns the Rwanda-backed M23 offensive. The actions by the M23 and the Rwandan Defense Forces constitute a blatant violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they have grave humanitarian consequences. The people of Eastern DRC, a region already facing severe poverty and instability and marked by decades of conflict, now face a spiraling humanitarian and human rights crisis. There have been appalling reports of severe sexual and gender-based violence by both sides, including mass rapes, the use of child soldiers, and summary killings. Information received from Goma's hospitals paint a horrific picture of utter disregard of human rights, humanitarian law, and indeed humanity. We therefore thank the High Commissioner for his timely briefing today. We echo his call for an end to the violence and for all parties to uphold their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. This conflict and the severe sufferings of civilians have lasted far too long. They must end, not spread further. We urge all parties to fully commit to a peaceful and negotiated resolution of the conflict, an inclusive political process under African leadership, as already laid out in the Luanda and Nairobi processes. It is the only way forward. Rwanda must withdraw its troops and support for M23. The DRC also needs to take Rwandan security concerns seriously, counter hate speech and neutralize anti-Rwandan militia. The affected civilians, women and children in particular, rely on the vital support of peacekeepers and humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian organizations need full, safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all people in need, so that they can continue their life-saving efforts. We therefore call upon all actors to grant this access immediately. We welcome that the initiative has been brought forward by the concerned country, the DRC itself. Germany is ready to support the proposed establishment of an independent fact-finding mission to ensure that violations are documented and all perpetrators are held accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole.
I call on the distinguished representative of Switzerland. Thank you, President. Switzerland supports the convening of this special session, and we express our consternation at the worsening security, humanitarian and human rights situation in Eastern DRC. We denounce the attack on Goma by the M23 with Rwanda's support and its continuing advance through South Kivu. Switzerland calls for the DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity to be respected. Violence has reached an alarming level, causing unspeakable suffering for civilians. All human rights violations over international humanitarian law, particularly attacks on civilians and civilian property, as well as conflict-related and gender-based sexual violence, are unacceptable and cannot go unpunished. Goma is facing a humanitarian emergency. Shops, warehouses have been looted by different parties to conflict, making it harder and harder to get humanitarian aid. We call for humanitarian access to be restored swiftly, including the reopening of Goma Airport for humanitarian flights. All parties to conflict must agree a ceasefire and that humanitarian aid be provided to the vulnerable, measures be put in place to ensure the safety of displaced persons, their access to basic services pursuant to international law. Switzerland calls on all parties to strictly respect international humanitarian law, protect civilians in particular, and immediately de-escalate. We call on Rwanda to stop its support for M23 and withdraw its troops from Congolese territory. Furthermore, the DRC must roll out its plan to neutralise the Democratic Forces of Liberation of Rwanda, and we also condemn the brazen atrocities committed by the ADF. Lastly, Switzerland supports mediation efforts made by the regional community, particularly the Luanda process. We urge the DRC and Rwanda to resume negotiations and encourage initiatives to combat impunity. Justice and accountability for international humanitarian law violations, those of human rights, must be made a priority. I thank you. Thank you, and I'll call on the distinguished representative of Albania. Thank you, President.
Albania aligns itself with the EU statement. The situation in Democratic Republic of Congo is of serious concern. We are particularly alarmed by the recent surge in violence in the eastern region of the country, where clashes between government forces and M23 armed group has resulted in significant loss of lives, displacements of civilians, and widespread suffering. Albania strongly condemns persistent human rights violations and abuses, including sexual violence, summary execution, enforced disappearance, and targeted attack on human rights defenders, journalists, and other civil society actors. We express our profound alarm about the increasing danger to women and girls for violence, including rape, and the recruitment of children by armed groups. We urge M23 to stop its advance and echo the Secretary General appealed to Rwanda to cease support of M23 and withdraw from DRC territory. Albania called for robust accountability measures to be implemented. We will support the establishment of an independent fact-finding mission to investigate human rights violations and international human rights violations in North and South Kivu province. It's imperative that those responsible for human rights violations and atrocities are brought to justice. We commend the efforts of United Nations and other humanitarian organizations working tirelessly on the ground to deliver aid and to protect vulnerable populations. Albania reaffirmed its support for MONUSCO and condemned any attack against UN mandate force. We believe that there is no military solution to the crisis and emphasize the need for an inclusive political dialogue between DRC, Rwanda, and other regional and international actors to address the root causes of the conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus.
Mr. President, High Commissioner, Cyprus aligns itself with the statement of the EU. We add our voice to express our deep concern about the continued and intensifying escalation of the crisis in eastern DRC. We condemn the reported widespread violations of human rights, including summary executions, sexual and gender-based violence, the recruitment of child soldiers, but also the increasing number of internally displaced persons. At the same time, we're extremely worried by the interruption in humanitarian assistance, as well as shortages of food, water and medical supplies, all of which have had a negative impact on civilians. All sides have an obligation to prioritize the protection of civilians and their safe and unhindered access to humanitarian aid. The ongoing instability risks unleashing the possibility of greater regional war, evoking the catastrophic conflicts of the 1990s. Moreover, it undermines African-led efforts to reach a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The continued advances of the M23, backed by Rwanda, constitutes a violation of the agreed ceasefire and a violation of international law. We reaffirm our commitment to the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of the DRC and all states in the region. We express our unwavering support for MONUSCO and condemn attacks against UN-mandated forces. We support the resumption of negotiations within the Luanda process and urge all sides to reach a sustainable, peaceful and political solution to the crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole à la...
I call on the distinguished representative of Belgium. President, Belgium welcomes the initiative taken by the DRC in calling for a special session of the Council. In view of the escalating conflict in eastern DRC, this Council cannot remain silent because its role is to prevent and independently report on human rights violations. This is particularly the case when it's the concerned country of the violations which calls for the sanction. Belgium supports thus the Congolese authorities' request for an independent fact-finding mission on incidents that have occurred since January 2022 in the east of the country. Full light must immediately be shed on these violations and their perpetrators held accountable. On a number of occasions, Belgium has raised its concern and denounced the number of human rights violations in DRC, particularly those against women and children. Once more, my country is alarmed by reports of massacres, conflict-related sexual violence, summary executions, attacks on civilian infrastructure, and a disastrous humanitarian situation in which the number of displaced people and redisplaced people has increased enormously. This compounds a long list of violations and attacks throughout the country. Belgium calls on all parties to conflict to immediately halt the violations of international humanitarian law and human rights and to commit once again to peace negotiations. We condemn the M23 offensive supported by Rwanda, and we call upon the Rwandan government to withdraw all its troops from the DRC and to halt any form of support to the M23. In addition to establishing the independent fact-finding mission, Belgium underscores the importance of ensuring that this mission be properly funded and staffed immediately. We also call upon the Council's international team of experts to cooperate fully with the Commission of Inquiry. I round off by recalling the importance of fighting impunity both for victims and the stability of the country and the Great Lakes region. We call upon all parties to make a constructive and serious commitment to these efforts. I thank you. I now call upon the distinguished representative of Costa Rica. Thank you very much, President. Costa Rica thanks the Democratic Republic of the Congo because against a backdrop of attacks on multilateralism and the human rights situation, this country, which is mired in a terrible situation in its own territory, is encouraging us to use the mechanisms that the international community has created to act effectively, as the Council has done in the past. The east of the DRC is going through an incredibly serious humanitarian and human rights crisis, which is driven by the violence of the M23 rebels and its conflict with government forces and other armed parties. This situation has led to mass displacement, killings, sexual and gender-based violence on a systematic level, and destruction of basic infrastructure, including hospitals and houses. Recent reports confirm atrocities such as 163 women being burned alive in Goma and deliberate attacks against women, human rights defenders and maternity hospitals. This is unprecedented and unacceptable. This conflict is grounded in complex geopolitics with a view to controlling the vast mineral resources in the region. For decades, we've been raising alarm about the environment, water and natural resources being the cause of many modern conflicts. That's why it's vital to work towards the respect, promotion and protection of the human right to a free, healthy and sustainable environment, as well as ensuring that we have a sustainable environment so that we can promote economic, social and cultural rights, because they're the tools for building peaceful societies. President Costa Rica calls for a halt to all hostilities and that all parties to conflict respect human rights, international humanitarian law. It's vital that victims are supported and have access to humanitarian aid, and that perpetrators of war crimes and human rights violations be held accountable. And those who benefit from very profitable contracts with Rwanda and the DRC in the mineral industry must be held accountable for putting their economic interests above human dignity. We cannot allow this to... The speaker is interrupted. I call on the distinguished representative of Burundi. President, Burundi welcomes the convening of this special session on the human rights situation in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and is pleased to be among the 27 member states who have taken the initiative to support this session. In fact, Goma is the scene of unprecedented humanitarian disaster. Thousands have lost their lives, including women and children, and around 1 million people have been displaced and made refugees. This is a tragic consequence of the M23 incursion with the military and logistic support of Rwanda. This violates the basic principles of international relations established in the UN Charter. We'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate the Burundian government's solidarity with the Congolese people and express our condolences to bereaved families. We'd also like to pay tribute to UN peacekeepers who've made the ultimate sacrifice for the purposes of peace. So our compassion is extended to delegations of Uruguay, Malawi and South Africa. For over 30 years, the Democratic Republic of Congo has been suffering, and we cannot turn a blind eye to this. This is because there are dark foreign interests which underlie the geopolitical situation and the looting and illicit exploitation of natural resources. For over 10 years, Burundi has been calling on the Council to pay attention to the situation of Rwanda supporting armed terrorist groups which are on the rampage killing civilians. We have seen this quite clearly. There's the risk of this igniting the Great Lakes region. Time has come to establish the facts, to hold those responsible for those actions and adopt a strong resolution which denounces a serious and persistent human rights violation in North and South Kivu and which calls on the Rwandan forces and M23 to withdraw from occupied areas. Territorial integrity and sovereignty of the DRC must be restored and respected. Burundi firmly believes in the peaceful coexistence between nations, and we would underscore the efforts made by the African Union as well as other regional mechanisms and sub-regional mechanisms in the Luanda and Nairobi processes. I thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the President for convening this special session. Japan expresses its deep concern about the deteriorating human rights and humanitarian situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, particularly around Goma in North Kivu Province and Minova in South Kivu Province. A recent offensive in the region has resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people and numerous casualties among the civilian population and has severely affected vulnerable people, including women and children. Japan extends its deepest condolences to the victims and conveys its heartfelt sympathy to all who are injured. Those lost and injured include personnel of the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUSCO, and the Southern African Development Community Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Japan renews its call on M23 to immediately cease its attacks and withdraw. In this regard, we urge all parties to respect the ceasefire agreement and to respect MONUSCO's mission to protect civilians and ensure humanitarian access to those in need. We also call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian rights and humanitarian law, including protection of the civilians and diplomatic missions. Japan believes that the diplomatic and political solution by the DRC, Rwanda and other countries in the region, as well as the securing of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC based on respect for the rule of law and humanitarian dignity, are important in order to achieve sustainable peace in the eastern DRC. Japan supports regional peace mediation efforts, including the Rwanda process and the Nairobi process, and calls for the immediate resumption of negotiations for peace. Japan will support the proposed resolution and continue to work with the international community and support regional peace mediation efforts aiming to protect civilians and uphold their human rights. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brazil is following with great concern the deterioration of human rights and humanitarian situation in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We call on all parties to recommit to the ceasefire agreement and to engage in ongoing mediation efforts, as well as to respect international human rights and humanitarian law. Moreover, Brazil urges all actors to allow unimpeded humanitarian aid to the population affected. Brazil emphasizes that the protection of civilians is a fundamental obligation under international law. We are particularly concerned about acts of violence targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, including reports of sexual and gender-based violence. Threats against human rights defenders, journalists, and civil society organizations must also be condemned, along with the use of hate speech. We reiterate that all parties to the conflict are obliged to ensure the safety and the protection of UN personnel and facilities. Brazil supports the role of MONUSCO and SAMI DRC to regional stability and peace. Brazil also supports the work of the HRC's team of international experts to improve the human rights situation in the whole Congo and as an important means to bring peace and security to the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea is gravely concerned about the rapidly deteriorating situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. Innocent civilians, including women and children, are enduring extreme suffering due to widespread violence, displacement, and deprivation of essential services such as food, water, and health care. We condemn persistent violations of international human rights and international humanitarian laws, including sexual and gender-based violence, summary executions, and forced recruitment of child soldiers. Reports of explosive weapons used in populated areas and attacks on internally displaced person sites are particularly alarming. In this regard, we urge all parties to end violence and uphold their obligations under international law. In particular, we call on M23 to immediately cease its territorial expansion and reverse its military offensive without delay. Even at this very important very moment, civilians continue to flee in search of refuge with no safe alternatives. The ongoing hostilities must stop to prevent further human suffering. It is crucial that the Human Rights Council provides necessary support for thorough investigations into grave human rights violations and abuses with a view to bringing the perpetrators to justice and ensuring the comprehensive accountability. Furthermore, both the DRC and Rwanda must heed the international community's call for a return to meaningful negotiations and fully honor their obligations under the Rwanda process. A sustained and inclusive dialogue is crucial to achieving a long-term and peaceful resolution to the crisis. As a committed member of the Human Rights Council, the Republic of Korea will continue to work with the international community to ensure that human rights remain at the center of our collective response to this crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, China is following closely the security situation in the eastern part of the DRC. We are alarmed and shocked by the recent sharp escalation of tensions. We strongly condemn the attacks on civilians and UN peacekeepers, and are worried about the human rights and humanitarian crisis resulting from the situation. China reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, including that of the DRC. And China supports the efforts of the governments concerned to safeguard national security. We believe diplomatic negotiations are the only way to resolve the questions in the eastern part of the DRC. We call on all parties to the conflict to fully respect international law, to protect fundamental human rights, to achieve immediate ceasefire, return to diplomatic dialogue, and resolve their concerns through dialogue and negotiation. China advocates African solutions to African problems and calls on all parties to support the mediation efforts of relevant regional organizations and African countries. Mr. President, there is a clear division of labor among the various organs of the UN, and only each plays its proper role can synergy be achieved. At a time when the Security Council has already intervened but has not yet made a decision, we believe this Council should act prudently. This is a special session at the request of the DRC. During this session, we believe any discussion and action should reflect international solidarity and to create favorable conditions to prevent further deterioration, to promote de-escalation and political solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia maintains sisterly relations with the DRC and countries of the region and is concerned by current developments and underscores the urgent need to address the humanitarian crisis and restore peace in the DRC. Ethiopia reiterates the call by the Secretary General of the UN, the chairperson of the AU Commission, for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the protection of civilians. Ethiopia also supports the call by the African Union Peace and Security Council for the strict adherence to international humanitarian law and human rights law. We emphasize the need to protect civilians, internally displaced persons, medical sites, and peacekeepers. Ethiopia reaffirms the fundamental importance of respecting the principles of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign nations and fostering friendly relations among states. These principles are critical to build trust and lay the foundation for peace in the Great Lakes region. It is essential that neighboring countries and regional economic communities adopt a coherent and constructive approach in supporting the DRC's pursuit of peace and security. In accordance with the Addis Ababa Framework Agreement, the African Union should discharge its coordination role in supporting the Luanda and other relevant regional processes and must continue to exercise political leadership in addressing the legitimate security concerns of neighboring countries. Ethiopia emphasizes the importance of international support for the DRC in consolidating state authority, particularly in the eastern provinces where the lack of effective governance and security exacerbates the humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian and life-saving assistance must be scaled up in support of populations most affected by the conflict, particularly women and children. Ethiopia also emphasizes that safety of peacekeepers is of paramount importance. Ethiopia's commitment to peacekeeping in the Great Lakes region is long-standing. In the 1960s, Ethiopian peacekeepers were at the forefront of the UN operations in Congo, where we sustained some of the largest peacekeeping casualties in the history of the mission. We call on all armed actors to refrain from the heinous conduct of targeting peacekeepers. In conclusion, Ethiopia remains firm in its belief that a sustainable resolution to the ongoing crisis can only be achieved through inclusive dialogue, strengthened by regional cooperation and the full engagement of the international community. Ethiopia stands ready to continue its constructive role in supporting the DRC and regional peace processes. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Thank you, President. Mexico expresses its consternation at the escalating violence in eastern DRC. This had a dire effect on the human rights situation. Reports of a dreadful situation are particularly worrying. People have died, been displaced, there's a lack of basic services, and civil infrastructure has been destroyed, amongst other things. We particularly deplore the reported conflict-related sexual violence which disproportionately affects women and children. We stand in solidarity with the victims and survivors of acts of violence. In view of the very serious situation, Mexico supported the DRC's request to convene a special session of the Human Rights Council so that we can hold a dialogue and take action. This reflects the relevance of this multilateral forum, and that's why Mexico is taking the floor here in this forum to urgently call for a dialogue between the parties and a halt to hostilities, as well as full respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We also make an appeal for the Rwanda and Nairobi processes to be resumed, and we reiterate our firm support for MONUSCO. President, Mexico also supports the High Commissioner for Human Rights calls for the human rights crisis in the Eastern DRC to be addressed. And that's why we welcome the fact that it was the DRC itself, as the concerned country, that requested this special session and has submitted a draft resolution to establish an independent fact-finding mission which must investigate alleged human rights abuses and violations and those of international humanitarian law committed by all parties to conflict. And considering the principle of African solutions to African problems, Mexico supports the idea that the decision taken by the Council complements sub-regional efforts to bring peace to the area led by the East Africa Community and SADC, and we pray that the upcoming summit in Tanzania will help us work towards peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement, and we thank the Democratic Republic of Congo for taking the initiative for the special session. We consider this special session and the wide support it received to be a vote of confidence in this Council and its role in upholding international human rights law, wherever and whenever. Like many others, we are concerned about the rapidly deteriorating situation in the DRC. Concretely, the Kingdom of the Netherlands calls upon the Rwandan government to immediately withdraw all of its troops from the territory of the DRC and end all forms of support for M23. At the same time, we feel the need to urge the DRC to stop hate speech and cease cooperation with the FDLR and other armed groups. Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, you would agree that the abuses and violations committed by any party to the conflict currently ongoing in the east of DRC need to be documented and the evidence collected preserved so that perpetrators on both sides can be held accountable for their crimes. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. South Africa stands in solidarity with the people of the DRC following the destruction wreaked on their lives of the innocent as a result of the recent M23 offensive in the eastern part of the country. We wish to reaffirm our unwavering commitment to continue supporting the DRC to secure the lasting peace and prosperity that its people and those of the Great Lakes have yearned for and rightly deserve. It is for this reason that South Africa supported the request by the DRC to hold a special session, given the gravity of the human rights situation in the country as reflected by the horrific violations and abuses of international human rights and humanitarian law that have been perpetrated in this regard. These include the summary executions and forced disappearances, recruitment of children, forced labor and conscription, together with indiscriminate attacks against already vulnerable populations. Of particular concern are the reports of the high levels of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence targeting women and girls, which, as the High Commissioner has stated, has been an appalling feature of the armed conflict in the eastern part of the country. Beyond the dire human rights situation, South Africa is also deeply concerned about the exacerbation of the humanitarian crisis. Accordingly, given the unfolding humanitarian tragedy, and in line with the statement of the UNHRC meeting of 26 January 2025, South Africa calls on the M23, the Rwandan Defense Forces and other unauthorized armed groups to immediately cease their armed activities and guarantee rapid, unhindered and safe access to humanitarian aid without any further delay. We welcome regional efforts, including the extraordinary summit of SADC, held on 31 January 2025 in Harare, the joint SADC-EAC summit currently taking place in Dar es Salaam. We similarly reiterate that there can be no military solution to the current conflict and call on parties concerned to immediately go back to the Luanda process and resume the Nairobi processes. Given the sheer scale of this human suffering, we fully support the resolution that is currently under consideration, and indeed we believe that the establishment of the fact-finding mission is the right way to go. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, my delegation welcomes the wisdom of the Council in convening this special session at the request of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We are deeply concerned by the reemergence of the conflict in the east of the DRC, giving rise to systematic violence, especially attacks against civilians, women and children, as well as massive human rights and international humanitarian law violations. The extreme situation in which millions of Congolese find themselves is alarming. We require access for humanitarian access to the vulnerable, and we call to all parties their responsibilities under IHL. Persons must be protected, and humanitarian assistance must be provided in an unimpeded fashion. We call for restraint and de-escalation with a view to resuming dialogue, with a view to a political solution to put an end to the plight of the Congolese, to uphold the respect of the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the DRC, and the restoration of a lasting peace in the region. In this spirit, we align ourselves with the conclusions of the Community of Eastern Africa and the Southern African Community. We are particularly pleased at the holding in Dar es Salaam at this very moment of a joint summit between SADC and the Eastern African Community. We fully support the regional processes underway and call on all parties to uphold their commitments in the face of heavy adversity. We are committed in Kenya and Angola, and the support is provided. We are prepared to extend our mediation efforts to the restoration of peace and stability in the DRC and the region of the Great Lakes as a general. Thank you.
Distinguished representative of the Gambia.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Gambia extends its deepest condolences to the government and people of the Democratic Republic of Congo for the tragic loss of lives in recent events that have engulfed the eastern part of the country. We stand in solidarity with all affected families and communities during this period. As a firm advocate of accountability for gross human rights abuses whenever they occur, the Gambia underscores the importance of accountability mechanisms as a critical pillar of ending impunity. The Human Rights Council has a crucial role to play to restore respect for human rights for the people of DRC and ensure accountability for perpetrators of human rights violations. However, the crisis in DRC requires a comprehensive and inclusive approach to ensure lasting peace and security. In this regard, the upcoming AU Peace and Security Council meeting at the heads of states level on the 14th of February 2025 will provide an opportunity to chart a path forward for sustainable peace in the region. Accordingly, the Gambia stresses the need for coordinated efforts between the mechanisms established by the Human Rights Council and the regional peace efforts in the interest of the long-suffering victims of the crisis. Mr. President, the Gambia further calls on all parties to uphold the principles of international humanitarian law and human rights to ensure the protection of civilians and safeguard their fundamental rights and freedoms. The Gambia remains committed to supporting all efforts aimed at ending impunity for human rights violations and achieving lasting peace in the DRC and in the Great Lakes region. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kyrgyzstan.
Mr. President, Kyrgyzstan is deeply concerned with the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in the east of Democratic Republic of Congo, and we fully support the decision on the fact-finding mission. We commend the continued efforts of the African Union and recall the communique of January 28th, adopted by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, that calls all parties to seek peaceful diplomatic solutions to end hostilities. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity as enshrined in the UN Charter. As a candidate for the UN Security Council, we are convinced that the adherence to this principle helped us to keep us safe so far from the World War III. Kyrgyzstan also firmly believes that the state is the ultimate guarantor of the human rights. Only viable state of the Democratic Republic of Congo might ensure human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bulgaria aligns with the EU statement. Let me highlight that Bulgaria is deeply concerned over the human rights situation in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which continues to deteriorate as hostilities between the two sides of the conflict are gravely escalating. We strongly condemn the persistent violations and abuses of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas, summary executions, sexual violence, forced conscription of children into armed forces, forced child labor, and the forced displacement of populations, as evidenced by the High Commissioners and other reports we heard earlier this morning. We demand swift measures to ensure enhanced protection of civilians, especially those in vulnerable situations, women, children, persons with disabilities, and the elderly. Bulgaria calls for an immediate cessation of violence and for all parties to the conflict to fulfill their obligations under international human rights and international humanitarian law. We firmly condemn the attacks on UN humanitarian personnel. We underscore the necessity of ensuring immediate and unimpeded access to humanitarian and medical aid of the civilian population. Bulgaria declares its support for the establishment of the independent fact-finding commission of the serious violations and abuses of human rights and serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we hope that the Commission will be operational soon. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Je donne la parole à la distinguée.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malawi.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this session. And Malawi also thanks the High Commissioner for his statement. We expressed our grave concern on the ongoing situation in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which has resulted in loss of lives, injuries, displacement of mostly women and children, and a fragile security and humanitarian situation. As a contributing country to the Southern African Development Community Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Malawi welcomes the efforts being made by relevant regional and international organizations in working towards sustained peace in the eastern part of the DRC and the entire region. We welcome the political and diplomatic steps taken by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union and the Southern African Development Community as reflected in their respective communique of 28th and 31st January 2025. The special session of this Council, therefore, is adding a very important layer of ongoing efforts in addressing the situation in the eastern part of the DRC. We urge all parties to engage in coordinated efforts of dialogue, such as the Rwanda and Nairobi processes for the restoration of peace and security in eastern DRC. We condemn the violence and reaffirm our solidarity with the people of the DRC in their pursuit of safeguarding their independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, as well as sustainable peace, security, and development. We extend our condolences to the DRC for their lives lost, and to South Africa and Tanzania, who alongside Malawi have lost soldiers in this violence. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. We'd like to welcome the convening of this session and the reports on the human rights situation in North and South Kivu. Bolivia is deeply concerned about the worsening situation in eastern DRC. We reject all forms of violence, particularly those that constitute serious human rights violations. We appreciate the request made by the government of the DRC to draw the international community's and this council's attention to the need for urgent monitoring and investigation measures on recent events in the country. This is particularly important because it's the concerned country. Bolivia rejects all foreign interference in the DRC, and as the UN Charter stipulates, the sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected. We must ensure that there are peaceful relations between states through political dialogue, so we support the regional mediation process in order to achieve a definitive end to hostilities. Natural resources cannot be sources of violence and confrontation. We reject exploitation of natural resources to feed international capital. We must respect Mother Earth. We believe that the Council's resolution must contribute to de-escalating violence. A fact-finding mission must act objectively, transparently, on the basis of non-politicization and non-selectivity. It must count on the support of concerned countries and have the necessary resources. We join those calling for an end to impunity and for holding the perpetrators of human rights violations accountable. We support continuing efforts to end hate speech and racially based discrimination. We must have truth, justice, reparations, and non-repetition, and we urge all parties to the hostilities to honour agreements on ceasefires and to avoid any further escalation of hostilities. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Thank you, President. Colombia expresses its concern at the escalation of hostilities and violation against civilians in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We express our solidarity with victims. We call upon armed actors to stop confrontations and respect international humanitarian law. Gustavo Petro, our president, has often stated that it's only dialogue between parties to a conflict which are the acceptable means for solving problems. We call upon the parties to conflict to have a serious and honest dialogue which will allow them to find a solution which is based on peace. We support regional initiatives for peace and stability. With this in mind, we welcome the dialogues which have been initiated or which will be initiated tomorrow in the Tanzanian capital. There is a long path to peace, as we know, and it's only through respecting human rights and ensuring truth, justice, and guarantees of non-repetition that we will achieve peace. They must be at the very heart of all processes. We support the convening of this special session, and we appreciate the DRC's call for the Council to establish an independent fact-finding mission. Weapons do not support life in any conflict. Colombia has co-sponsored the convening of this session. There was a terrible genocide in 1994, which reminds us that indifference and silence are not an option for the Council. We cannot forget the very reason for this organisation established in the preamble to the Charter. We must avoid the scourge of war for future generations. Thank you.
Merci. Nous allons maintenant passer à la liste des
Thank you. We will now take up the list of speakers for observers of the Council, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
Liechtenstein is deeply concerned about the recent escalation in violence in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, resulting in summary executions, forced conscription and labor, as well as a large amount of cases of conflict-related sexual violence. My delegation supports the High Commissioner's call for an end to violence and for all parties to uphold their obligations under international human rights and international humanitarian law. We stress the need for independent investigations into the violations in view of ensuring comprehensive accountability. While Liechtenstein supports the creation of an investigative mandate by the Human Rights Council to investigate acts of violations and international crimes committed in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it is also important that the newly established mandate cooperates in a complementary manner with the already existing mandate of the team of international experts and the OHCHR. More precision in the mandate on several aspects would have been welcome. Furthermore, we would like to stress the importance of the cooperation with the ongoing investigation of the International Criminal Court that, after a referral by the country concerned, equally focuses on the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg. Thank you, Mr. President. Luxembourg aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We thank the High Commissioner, the Special Representative of the Secretary General, and the Chair of the Coordination Committee of the Special Procedures. Human rights in the east of the DRC are in a deep crisis. The M23, supported by Rwanda, has caused unspeakable human suffering, in particular with the taking of the town of Goma. Reports of sexual and sexist violence, especially in the aftermath of the prison break of Munzenze in Goma, are deeply shocking. Hundreds of thousands of persons are displaced at the very moment where the international humanitarian system is undergoing a deep funding crisis. It is essential to shed light on the human rights and international humanitarian law violations and abuses over the past months and years, but also on the deep root causes of conflicts which have prevented the Congolese from living in peace, in particular corruption and poor governance. Finally, human rights defenders in the DRC must be protected in order to carry out their crucial work in safety. Luxembourg welcomes the resolution presented by the delegation of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We hope that this Council will ask for the prompt deployment of a fact-finding mission of the High Commissioner, followed in due time by an independent commission on inquiry. We also express our unwavering support to the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Merci. I give the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President. Ireland aligns with the EU statement. President, the situation in eastern DRC is appalling, with numerous credible reports of abuses and violations of human rights, a rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation and unconscionable suffering inflicted on the civilian population. The offensive of M23, supported by Rwanda, that has resulted in the taking of further DRC territory is an unacceptable breach of international law. The escalation of the conflict is a violation of an agreed ceasefire and further deepens the grave humanitarian crisis, pushing additional IDPs towards already overburdened camps. President M23 should stop its advance and withdraw immediately. We are horrified by the use of sexual and gender-based violence by parties to the conflict, and we urge the DRC to cease cooperation with the FDLR and other armed groups that have committed abuses. Ireland supports Africa-led efforts to find a lasting solution to the situation in eastern DRC, including the Luanda and Nairobi processes, and we welcome the DRC's initiative at this Council and support the establishment of an independent investigation. President, we must be clear in our unequivocal demand for peace, justice and accountability, as well as respect for international law and human rights, regardless of where these are being violated or abused. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we note with alarm the development of the situation in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is rapidly deteriorating, especially with the taking of the city of Goma, with more than 1 million civilians. We note the increase in number of violence and the number of civilian victims, the increased numbers of IDPs and Congolese refugees in neighboring countries. We are concerned by the difficult situation of the most vulnerable, especially women and children. We are deeply concerned by the humanitarian consequences of these events. The situation in North Kivu, already difficult, is turning into a genuine humanitarian catastrophe. Goma is practically cut off from the outside world, which can lead to extreme impacts on the residents of the town and refugees fleeing there. A similar situation arises in the other towns and villages taken by the M23. We decisively condemn the crimes against the civilians in the east of the country. We call for prompt cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of M23 from the territories it occupies, the resumption of a negotiating process within regional peacekeeping initiatives. So we are convinced that an end to the violence can only be found in a political and diplomatic dialogue between all parties to the conflict. Work in this direction should be carried out without any politicization and must take into account national, historical, ethnic and cultural specificities of the country. Thank you for your attention.
That's coming up. And exciting.
Egypt. Oh, you're on again, right?
No.
Oh, they're going over, aren't they?
What does it mean?
Oh, no, it's 12.
Interpretation on?
Apologies, yes.
Okay, can you please start your statement again? I apologize.
Let me start again. The Republic of Moldova is deeply concerned about the outbreak of the armed conflict and the human rights violations in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo caused by the renewed offensive of M23 supported by Rwanda. Violations of international humanitarian law and of the human rights, including the widespread sexual violence, summary executions, recruitment and use of child soldiers, must stop immediately by all parties. All perpetrators must be held accountable. We support the calls for establishing an independent fact-finding mission to enhance these efforts. We continue to support MONUSCO and call for unhindered access of humanitarian assistance as well as the protection of civilians and IDPs. We condemn the military presence of M23 in the DRC and call for its immediate withdrawal. We also call on DRC to take their efforts to reduce reasons for tensions and counter the hate speech. The Republic of Moldova supports the efforts of a peaceful resolution of the conflict, including the Luanda and Nairobi processes, and welcome the upcoming meeting in Dar es Salaam. We stand by the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Please allow me at the outset to congratulate the Democratic Republic of the Congo for having requested the convening of this special session at such an important time. This request has benefited from a great deal of support in the African continent. President, the situation in the eastern DRC does not get enough attention, including a lack of attention from this Council. We condemn the recent M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces offensive, which has compounded a terrible humanitarian situation. We call for unfettered humanitarian access to be guaranteed to enable vital aid to reach those who need it. In particular, the United Kingdom calls upon the M23 in Rwanda to reopen Goma Airport as quickly as possible. The extent of sexual and gender-based violence in the DRC is appalling. We're horrified by reports of brutal rapes and murders of hundreds of women in Muzenze prison in Goma. We must react firmly and collectively to ensure an in-depth investigation to ensure that impunity ends. With this in mind, the United Kingdom is convinced we must use all the necessary mechanisms at the Council's disposal. Thank you. I call upon the distinguished representative of Egypt. President, Egypt is deeply concerned about the most recent developments in eastern DRC. They have caused a large number of deaths and injuries amongst civilians and peacekeepers. Egypt extends its condolences to the DRC and MONUSCO. We condemn all acts of violence which only undermine peace and stability in the east of the country. Egypt reiterates its unwavering support to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the DRC. We insist that hostilities must end and that parties to conflict resume peace negotiations through the Nairobi and Luanda processes. We would like to underscore the importance of working towards an improvement in the human rights situation. There must be a conducive environment for peace and stability throughout the country, and so that the nation can be rebuilt. We thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
President Shannon, welcome to convening of this special session and commend the concerted efforts by multilateral and bilateral actors, including regional organizations and the government of Angola, in seeking a resolution to the crisis. The conflict is intensifying, causing further displacement and suffering among the civilian population. We strongly condemn the attacks against innocent civilians and peacekeepers, which constitute war crimes. We are deeply concerned about ethnically motivated attacks and call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We strongly urge the provisions of immediate, unhindered humanitarian aid to civilians amid the violence, which has overwhelmed hospitals and diseases risk from unattended corpses. We acknowledge the various diplomatic initiatives that have been undertaken, including several peace agreements and joint communique, which aim to resolve the conflicts in Eastern DRC. Notably, in 2007 joint communique between the DRC and Rwanda outlined a common approach to address threats to regional peace and stability, with both parties committing to specific actions. We call for the immediate and complete withdrawal of all foreign troops from the territory of DRC, and for all parties to engage in a constructive dialogue to find a sustainable solution to the crisis and alleviate the suffering of the Congolese people. We firmly support initiatives that aim to restore peace and stability to the Eastern DRC, maintain the territorial integrity of DRC, and ensure that those responsible for human rights violations are held accountable. I thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Distinguished President, Italy aligned itself with your statement. It's with deep concern that we observe the ongoing escalation of the conflict in the eastern provinces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This situation has worsened due to the renewed attacks by the M23 group supported by the Rwandan armed force. This escalation disrupts efforts laid by African nations to achieve a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Italy reiterates its full support for the Luanda and Nairobi peace regional processes. Italy strongly condemns the offensive of the M23 supported by Rwanda and the presence of Rwandan armed force in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is a breach of international law, the United Nations Charter and territorial integrity of Congo. We also persistently urge the Democratic Republic of Congo to stop collaborating with FDLR and other armed factions. We are appalled by the disturbing allegation of the serious human rights and international humanitarian law violation and abuses taking place in the country, including cases of summary execution, conflict-related sexual violence and mass rapes, forced conscription and forced labor. We call upon all parties to immediately cease all violations and abuses and to uphold their obligations to protect civilians in all circumstances, with particular attention to the most vulnerable, including women and children. In conclusion, Distinguished President, Italy reiterates its commitment to ensuring accountability and promoting peace and justice. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Holy See.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Holy See strongly condemns the recent offences in the eastern DRC, which has been further intensified by the capture of Goma by the M23 and its advance towards Bukavu. This has provoked an enormous loss of life and a worrying increase in human rights violations. It has led to looting in Goma and surrounding towns and has increased the massive displacement of populations. Even peacekeepers have been killed or injured. The airport of Goma should be reopened immediately, at least for the delivery of humanitarian aid and the evacuation of the most seriously wounded. And all parties concerned should make the necessary arrangements to this end. Pope Francis has urged the parties in conflict to commit themselves to the cessation of hostilities and to the safeguarding of the civilian population, recommending that the local authorities and the international community do everything possible to resolve the conflict situation by peaceful means. The Holy See expresses its condolences to all those who lost their loved ones. It also reminds all parties to the conflict of their obligation under humanitarian law, urges them to respect the ceasefire agreement, reaffirms its support for the Rwanda process, calls for an immediate resumption of negotiations within the framework, and welcomes the proposal to establish an independent fact-finding mission. The M23 should immediately cease all hostilities and withdraw from the occupied zones. The territorial integrity of the DRC must be fully respected. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Mr. President, Austria aligns with the EU statement. My country is deeply concerned about the rapid deterioration of the situation in eastern DRC as a result of the advances of the Rwanda-supported M23 militia on Goma and South Kivu, in particular the horrific reports on sexual violence, including rape and gang rape, committed by all parties to the conflict. IDPs have been expelled from camps by the M23 and subjected to forced labor and conscription, including children. Attacks on civilian infrastructure further exacerbate the suffering of the civilian population. We call on all parties to the conflict, in particular the armed forces of Rwanda and the DRC, as well as the M23, the FDLR and all other militias involved, to comply with the obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law. We strongly urge the M23 to halt the advance and withdraw immediately, and Rwanda to cease its support for the M23 and withdraw. We furthermore urge the DRC to cease cooperation with the FDLR and other armed groups. The people of Eastern DRC need a sustainable ceasefire and a return to the negotiating table to allow access for crucial humanitarian aid and to enable the work towards accountability. In this context, Austria welcomes the call for an independent fact-finding mission to hold all perpetrators accountable. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ukraine is deeply concerned about the developments in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in the wake of escalation of hostilities in the eastern part of the country. We strongly condemn the violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the DRC and the seizure of settlements in North Kivu province by Rwandan-backed rebel group M23. We consider unacceptable the spread of threats to the further seizure other cities and territories of the DRC, which is a gross violation of the norms and principles of international law and the UN Charter. We denounce the continued and widespread human rights violation and the breaches of international humanitarian law, including mass killing, conflict-related sexual violence, and targeted attacks on civilian population. We condemn the attacks against UN personnel and humanitarian workers, which constitute war crimes, and urge all relevant authorities to investigate and prosecute those responsible. We call upon the parties to find ways to cease hostilities and resolve the armed conflict, which has led to irreparable human losses for the Congolese people and the destruction of civilian infrastructure in the DRC. We support all relevant mediation efforts in this regard, particularly within the framework of the Rwanda process. Ukraine underlines the importance of the Council's proper response to the evolving human rights situation in the DRC. The Council action is needed to put an end to the suffering of the Congolese people. It's our common responsibility to act decisively and uphold the values of...
I call the distinguished delegate of Cameroon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Cameroon is deeply concerned by the escalating violence in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. My country is scarred by the unspeakable suffering of the people of Goma and the increased tensions in the region. This situation reminds of the dark moments of a period not so far back in history, which marked the entire world by its tragedy. My country calls for an immediate ceasefire and a peaceful settlement of the crisis and invites belligerents to create the proper conditions to ensure that humanitarian assistance can be deployed to alleviate the suffering and the distress of a helpless population. Cameroon is deeply committed to the values of peace enshrined in the UN Charter and calls on the international community to assist states and the people of the region to develop a culture of peaceful coexistence. We invite all to respect the inviolability of borders as inherited from decolonization. Cameroon welcomes the initiatives underway, both regional and international, to provide a lasting solution to this crisis, which is fundamentally unworthy of our era and which undermines the spirit and the very foundation of humanism. My country believes that the resolution, which should be the outcome of this special session of the Human Rights Council, should send a message not only to foster peace and diminish hatred, but also a warning to the architects of violence of any kind. Thank you.
The floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. Uruguay expresses its consternation at the worsening security situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo as a result of the activities of the M23 armed group in the eastern part of the country, as well as the persistent violations of international humanitarian law and human rights in this area, including through sexual and gender-based violence, the recruitment and conscription of child soldiers, and summary executions. We vehemently condemn recent attacks by the M23 armed groups against UN personnel, causing the death of MONUSCO peacekeepers, including the Uruguayan soldier Rodolfo Alvarez, as well as injuries suffered by 4 members of the Uruguayan contingent. These actions could constitute war crimes. We make a call for efforts to be stepped up to achieve an immediate ceasefire and for negotiations to be resumed through the Luanda and Nairobi processes. We urge all states in the region to refrain from any action which could compound the situation and that they cooperate to achieving a lasting political solution. Uruguay reiterates its commitment to peace in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and reiterates its support to MONUSCO at this critical time. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uganda.
Thank you, Mr. President. Uganda is deeply concerned by the current developments in the eastern part of the DRC. As one of the close neighbors to DRC, we have witnessed firsthand on the front line the devastating conflict that continues to cause loss of life, destruction of property, displacement of thousands of people that not only affects the region but exacerbates the refugee crisis in our country. And therefore, Uganda would like to underline the following. 1, urgent need for an immediate ceasefire to avert any further devastation and revert to dialogue. 2, call upon all parties to the conflict to pave way for unhindered access for humanitarian support to the civilians in the eastern part of the DRC. And 3, call on the international community to support the regional efforts being led by the East African Community and SADC to find a lasting solution to the conflict. Uganda is committed to continue working bilaterally with the DRC and through the existing regional frameworks to support efforts to restore peace and stability. And we call upon the international community and this Council to do the same. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Je donne la parole au
I call on the distinguished delegate of Canada.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Canada is seriously worried about the escalating violence in the eastern RDC following the occupation of Goma by the M23, which is supported by the Rwanda Defense Forces. We denounce widespread atrocities in the eastern DRC, including illegal attacks on civilians, displaced persons, and humanitarian actors, as well as massacres and abductions. We're worried about reports of conflict-related sexual violence against women and girls. These acts are heinous and are a violation of obligations under international law. Canada calls for an immediate halt to illegal attacks on civilians and civilian property, and we support the establishment of an independent fact-finding mission to hold the perpetrators for these violations accountable. We call attention to the fact that deliberate attacks on peacekeeping personnel are tantamount to war crimes. Canada calls on the M23 to halt its operations and Rwanda to withdraw its support and its presence from the country. We support humanitarian personnel's efforts and we call for the territorial integrity of the RDC to be respected and for a constructive dialogue to be held between the DRC and Rwanda. Thank you. I call upon the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, President. Australia welcomes this special session of the Council at such a crucial time for the people of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We are gravely concerned about the recent escalation of violence in the DRC, the devastating consequences for human rights, including the disproportionate impact on all women and children, and the potentially catastrophic implications for regional peace and security. We call for an immediate de-escalation, respect for the DRC's territorial integrity, and the withdrawal of Rwandan troops supporting the armed group M23's offensive on Goma. We are also deeply concerned by reports and documented cases of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence and of the failure to protect humanitarian personnel. We support the calls in the resolution presented to this Council for the establishment of a mandate to investigate the facts and circumstances of these, and all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law in North and South Kivu. We support efforts to ensure accountability is established. Parties to the conflict must uphold their obligations under international law, ensuring the protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel, and safe, rapid and unhindered access to vital aid. The situation is complex, and Australia welcomes the announcement of a joint Southern African Development Community and East African Community Summit on 7-8 February to bring together all parties and seek a negotiated way forward. Australia continues to encourage African-led solutions to the conflict and the promotion of sustainable peace through regional initiatives. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Paraguay.
Thank you very much, President. Paraguay is very concerned about the alarming situation faced by Congolese civilians as a result of escalating violence in the provinces of North and South Kivu. There are persistent violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. Civilians are the prime target once again of this kind of conflict, particularly women and girls. They're bearing the brunt of the attacks, whilst humanitarian aid is dangerously limited. Hospitals are overwhelmed, and there are reports of massacres, summary executions, sexual violence, mass displacement, and attacks on humanitarian actors and civilian infrastructure. The situation in the DRC shows us how urgent it is to strengthen monitoring and scrutiny mechanisms and the need for the Council to make efforts to alleviate the suffering of victims of human rights violations and abuses. It's absolutely vital that there be a halt to violence and that all parties respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. That's why we must have investigations into violations committed in order to... And the speaker is interrupted. I call upon Turkey.
President, in Turkey we're following recent clashes and grave violations of human rights with horrible impact, especially on civilian populations in eastern DRC with deepest concern. Turkey condemns the attacks, which has further deteriorated the already dire humanitarian situation in the region and resulted in loss of lives, including members of MONUSCO. We reaffirm our commitment to the independence, unity and territorial integrity of the DRC. We join the unanimous call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and establishment of permanent ceasefire. We urge all parties to return to dialogue. It is important to see that sustainable solution to the problem can only be found through peaceful means and inclusive dialogue among all parties concerned. In this regard, we reiterate our commitment to the principle of African solutions to African problems and express our full support to the Luanda process between Rwanda and DRC. We acknowledge the progress made under the Luanda process, the gains of which need to be preserved. It would also be essential to revive the Nairobi process led by the East African community. Mr. President, African ownership is essential. We trust that East African Community and South African Development Community joint summit meeting, which is being held in Jerusalem today and tomorrow, would contribute to easing of the tension and provide a common ground for further deliberations and sustainable peace.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guatemala.
Thank you very much, President. We appreciate the convening of this special session, and we express our deep concern at the security situation faced in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Guatemalan government vehemently condemns the offensive launched by the M23 movement in recent weeks, its expansion in North Kivu and the occupation of Goma. Guatemala promotes international peace and security and contributes troops to the United Nations peacekeeping mission. Since 2005, there's been a special forces contingent there comprising 182 officers. That's why we reiterate our unwavering support to ongoing peace efforts. The Luanda and Nairobi processes aimed at reducing tension in the DRC. We deplore the deaths of peacekeepers, which could constitute a war crime, and we pray for the swift recovery of the injured, including 2 Guatemalan officers. The human rights situation in the eastern DRC is alarming. We make an appeal for access to humanitarian assistance, basic health services, food and protection to be guaranteed, particularly for women and children. In addition, there's sexual and gender-based violence, which is of great concern.
Representative of Zambia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Zambia is deeply concerned with the reports on the deteriorating human rights situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo arising from the ongoing conflict. We are saddened that civilians, including women and children, are bearing the brunt of the ongoing armed conflict, insecurity, and human rights abuses. We appreciate the ongoing mediation efforts through regional processes under SADC and EAC aimed at resolving the conflict and restore peace and stability. Zambia calls on the regional and international community to urgently prioritize the protection of civilians, provision of humanitarian assistance, and ensure the effective application of human rights and humanitarian law. It is essential and urgent that we work together to address the root causes of the conflict to ensure lasting peace and security in the DRC, which will not only benefit its citizens, but also the wider region. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Thank you. Mr. President, the Council meets today to address yet another human rights crisis created by use of military force against civilians. This time in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We condemn M23's occupation of territories in eastern DRC. We underscore that sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC must be respected. Pakistan joins other delegations in condemning acts of mass killings, sexual violence, and other human rights violations, and is gravely concerned at the increasing scale and the growing intensity of violence perpetrated. We echo the calls by the High Commissioner for urgent action to stem grave human rights crisis in the region. As a major contributor to the UN peacekeeping forces, Pakistan condemns the attacks on UN peacekeepers and urges all parties to be mindful that such attacks may constitute war crimes. In order to stem human rights violations and move forward towards durable peace, we call for 1, resolute condemnation of violence against civilians, forced displacement and illegal occupation of territory, 2, uninterrupted access to human rights organizations to the affected areas, 3, recognition that there is no military solution to this conflict, and 4, as SADC and EAC summit meetings are being held today, we hope that international and regional diplomatic efforts, including the Luanda process and the Nairobi process, pick momentum. Finally, we hope that the Council will respond to this crisis while acting within its mandate and with consensus. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are deeply concerned about the deteriorating security and humanitarian situation in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which has serious implications for peace and security in that region. India strongly condemns the violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the DRC and the acts of violence that continue to undermine peace and stability in the region and violate human rights. India formally supports regional diplomatic initiatives such as the Luanda process and the Nairobi process, which could play a crucial role in fostering dialogue, de-escalating tensions, and promoting a peaceful resolution to the conflict. India has been contributing to the peacekeeping efforts in the region. We have around 1,200 UN peacekeepers serving in the Eastern DRC. A significant number of Indian nationals currently live in the region, and they are now facing displacement and increased risk of violence. We remain deeply concerned about their well-being and reiterate our call for the immediate cessation of hostilities. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mauritania.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Islamic Republic of Mauritania expresses its deep concern in the light of the deterioration of the humanitarian situation and the security situation in Goma, in the east of the DRC. This alarming evolution is a direct threat against the fundamental rights of civilians and is exacerbating their humanitarian suffering in a context marked by persistent violence and insecurity. We reaffirm our unwavering support to the unity and territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and call on all parties to uphold international humanitarian law and protect the rights of civilians, in particular women and children. We urge the Human Rights Council and the international community to take urgent measures to guarantee the protection of civilians and ensure unimpeded access to humanitarian aid. We reiterate our firm commitment to the fundamental principles of human rights, and we welcome efforts of the Human Rights Council to fight violations and promote accountability. We urge all to work for peace and security in the region.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Thank you, Mr. President. Angola welcomes Minister Patrice and his delegation and expresses deep concern about human rights situation in the east of DRC with the escalation of the conflict, including the seizure of the city of Goma. While condemning the latest actions carried out by the M23 group, Angola would like to call the Council's attention to the consequences at all levels of this situation in the Great Lakes region. The military actions of the M23 constitute a flagrant and unacceptable violation of ceasefire that has been in place since August 4, 2024, as well as constituting a severe violation to the territorial integrity of the DRC. We recall all the efforts and progress achieved within the scope of the Rwanda process, which defined the peaceful resolution of the conflict as the only way out of the crisis through a peace agreement between the parties to the conflict. Angola reiterates its call for scrupulous respect for human rights and international humanitarian law, which requires both parties to the conflict to pay particular attention to the protection of civilian populations, including IDP and refugee camps, as well as the safety of military personnel present in eastern DRC. Angola reaffirms President Lourenço's firm commitment to continue to play its role as EU mediator between the DRC and Rwanda, as well as welcomes all the diplomatic efforts currently underway to achieve security and peace, including the joint SADC EAC summit and others to follow. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
Thank you, Mr. President. Malta aligns itself with the statement by the European Union. The situation in the eastern regions of the Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of serious concern. As the High Commissioner warned on 28 January, as violence and urban conflict escalate within Goma, civilians face grave risks. These actions only serve to exacerbate an already dire situation which civilians are facing on a daily basis. Credible reports of rampant sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated in Goma and South Kivu are condemnable, and we call for these actions to immediately stop and for those responsible to be brought to justice. We also recall the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, Madam Gamba, issued a statement on 31st January highlighting the risk that children are facing in North Kivu and South Kivu, who are threatened with the risk of facing all 6 grave violations against children. We urge an end to violence and an urgent return to diplomatic engagement by all parties to ensure a long-lasting solution to this grave situation which threatens wider destabilization in the region. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. Peru would like to express its deep concern, echoing the High Commissioner and the Special Representative of the Secretary General at the escalation of violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We're particularly concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Goma. This has entailed serious violations of human rights and obligations under international humanitarian law. We deplore the civilians' suffering in line with its commitment to a lasting political solution to the conflict in the region. Peru has been participating in MONUSCO since 2024. As a contributor to the mission, Peru expresses its deep condolences for the families of peacekeepers who lost their lives in the course of duty. Peru reiterates its steadfast commitment to peace in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and its determination to continue working in MONUSCO. We express our confidence in multilateralism and collective efforts to protect civilians in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Mr. President. Zimbabwe is deeply concerned about the dire situation in the eastern part of the DRC. We condemn all acts of human rights violations as well as breaches of international humanitarian law by the armed groups involved in the conflict, including the killing of civilians and peacekeeping forces of the SADC mission and MONUSCO in the DRC. These acts of violence have a devastating impact on the lives of civilians who have been affected by conflict for decades. The current armed conflict worsens the security and humanitarian situation. We are concerned by the interruption of essential services and call for the restoration of water, electricity, means of communication, supply of food, and other essential commodities. Zimbabwe supports the diplomatic efforts towards peaceful resolution in the context of the SADC summit held in Harare on the 31st of January 2025 and the joint SADC EAC summit due to be held today and tomorrow in Tanzania. We call on the international community to support the peace efforts and respond to humanitarian assistance for the civilian population in eastern DRC. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Timor-Leste.
Thank you, Mr. President. Timor-Leste welcomes the holding of this special session on ongoing human rights situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. At the outset, my delegation would like to express its sincere condolences and solidarity to all victims of the conflict and to their families. We are deeply concerned with the recent bombardments and bloodshed surrounding Goma, which has led to death of at least 3,000 civilians with 1,000 more injured and in displaced recent weeks. We are further concerned about reports of conflict-related sexual violence committed against women and girls in the region, and we call on all parties to take urgent action to prevent sexual violence and improve care for the survivors. Moreover, my delegation calls on all parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian and human rights law and to bring an end to the violence. We encourage the leaders of involved parties to engage in constructive dialogue with the aim of finding a peaceful solution to the prolonged conflict and bring an end to the suffering of those in the region. Finally, Timor-Leste calls upon the international community to support the facilitate such constructive engagement and dialogue between the parties to reach a solution that prioritizes the human rights and well-being of the Congolese people. I thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovenia aligns with the EU statement. Slovenia is deeply alarmed by the rapid escalation of violence in the eastern DRC with the seizure of Goma, which has further caused human suffering. We remain concerned by the reports of widespread sexual and gender-based violence, the recruitment and use of child soldiers, and summary executions by armed groups. We remind all parties of their obligation to respect international humanitarian law and human rights law. Slovenia supports the establishment of an independent international mechanism which will investigate gross human rights violations and abuses in order that all those responsible are held to account. Slovenia reaffirms its support to MONUSCO and condemns all attacks on peacekeeping, humanitarian and medical personnel and civilian infrastructure. Slovenia condemns the actions of the M23 and calls for immediate cessation of all hostilities. We call on Rwanda to withdraw its forces from the eastern DRC and to cease its support to M23. We also call on the DRC to cease all cooperation with the FDLR. We urge Rwanda and the DRC to de-escalate immediately and return to mediation under the Luanda process. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Republic of Tanzania.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United Republic of Tanzania welcomes the holding of this special session. It is unfortunate that the recent conflict in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo has not only led to the killing of innocent civilians and destruction of infrastructure, but also worsened the security and humanitarian situation. It is important to respect international law and, for purposes of this session, human rights and international humanitarian law. We express our condolences for the innocent lives lost and wish the injured a speedy recovery. In this regard, we urge for the immediate restoration of humanitarian services to people and communities affected by the conflict. As the United Republic of Tanzania hosts the joint summit of East Africa Community and SADC on the situation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we further commend all regional and international efforts for peace and call upon the international community to continue supporting diplomatic efforts to end the conflict in the east of DRC through peaceful means, and for the concerned parties to engage in dialogue aimed at finding the lasting peace in the country. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Sudan.
Mr. President, South Sudan has been closely following the unfortunate events taking place in the east of DRC as a neighboring country of which we share common borders and ethnic groups. We firmly believe that the best way to resolve this ongoing conflict is through peaceful dialogue. Based on this steadfast position, my President, His Excellency Salva Kiir Mayardit, led a mediation during his tenure as a chairperson of the East African Community. We fully support the ongoing collective efforts by the leaders of South African Development Community and East African Community to address this conflict with the aim to reach peaceful settlement. These efforts are in line with the objective of finding African solutions for African problems, as well as with the agenda to silence the guns by 2030. South Sudan calls on the international community and partners to support these joint efforts and to deliver humanitarian assistance to those affected by the crisis. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Nous allons maintenant passer à la liste des...
We will now proceed to the list of speakers for non-governmental organizations, and I give the floor to Human Rights Watch.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Since the reemergence of the armed group M23 at the end of 2021, supported by Rwanda, hundreds of thousands have fled the east of the country, and there have been abuses by all parties. 2 million had taken refuge in Goma, where camps are now destroyed. The extent of the abuse is alarming. The UN states that at least 3,000 were killed in Goma in just a few days. Our sources in Goma speak of extreme need for medical care, of summary executions and sexual and gender-based violence. The humanitarians have been targeted by both parties. We express our solidarity with the Congolese civil society, which demands robust and independent documentation of crimes committed with a view to putting an end to the cycles of abuse and impunity which perpetuate violence since decades in the Congo. This crisis is extremely severe and requires the closest attention of all actors in the international system and regional actors. We call on all members to support the the creation of this important mandate and to ensure that there's a proper fight against impunity, to ensure the rights of victims and the survivors to justice and reparations. We call for the establishment of an urgent creation of such a mandate without delay. Thank you.
Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
La FIDH et ses partenaires de la société.
The Federation and its partners of the Congolese civil society are deeply concerned by the violation of human rights and international humanitarian right in Goma in the north and south of Kivu since the arrival of M23 and the Rwandan forces fighting the FARDC and their allies. The situation of human rights defenders is particularly alarming as they are targeted by both sides. Our organization is particularly concerned by information reporting the rapes of hundreds of women in the aftermath of the prison break in Munzenze in Goma. When the M23 entered town, these women subsequently died in a fire. The situation of armed conflict has lasted for 30 years. Impunity and the lack of truth, justice, and reparations for crimes that the populations of this region were subjected to feed into cycles of armed conflict. The international community must act quickly and robustly. Our organizations demand the establishment of an independent mechanism of inquiry to cover all crimes committed by all parties in conflict in the east of the DRC since the resurgence of the M23 end of 2021. The crisis demands the closest attention and complementary action by all actors in the international and regional humanitarian protection systems.
To World Organization Against Torture.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, the OMCT and the members of the network SOS Torture would like to draw your attention to the attacks against human rights defenders in the east of the DRC. Since the beginning of the war, the clashes between M23, supported by the Rwandan army, and the regular army of the DRC have brought Goma, Minova, and Saka and other areas into humanitarian catastrophe. At least 3,000 were killed and thousands of others were injured in less than 2 weeks. Human rights defenders are prevented from accessing victims and supporting them. We are receiving multiple testimonies relating extrajudiciary executions, attacks and intimidation against human rights defenders and their families in reprisal for their work in documenting and denouncing human rights violations and violations of humanitarian international law perpetrated since the beginning of this conflict. We call on the Council to adopt a resolution establishing an mechanism for international inquiry, cooperating with human rights defenders to collect, verify, and ensure the safety of information and evidence. The OMCT calls on states to do everything to guarantee the physical integrity of human rights defenders and members of their family. And finally, we call on stakeholders to guarantee the full participation of human rights defenders in negotiations for a lasting peace. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. I give the floor to the Rencontre Africaine for the Defense of Human Rights.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, in limine litis, Rada would like to congratulate you on your brilliant election to the presidency of the Council. Our organization has witnessed the immense contribution of Switzerland to strengthening international cooperation in the area of human rights, and we are pleased at this. Nevertheless, we are concerned at the situation in the east of the DRC, which has been subjected to an armed conflict since the 22nd of January, opposing the M23, supported by Rwanda, to the Congolese armed forces in the province of North Kivu. We deplore the escalating violence marked by the deterioration of the humanitarian situation, the rise in verbal hatred, as well as the disruption of diplomatic relations between the countries. Given this situation, RADO condemns the offensive of M23 and denounces attacks against Moscow personnel and the looting of their sites. Given the gravity of the crisis, we require the establishment of humanitarian corridors between Goma, Minova, and Bukavu to provide essential foodstuffs, rotate humanitarian personnel, and provide for the secure movements of civilians. We call on all parties to engage in an immediate ceasefire. Rwanda must withdraw its troops from the DRC, and the DRC must stop its support to the FDLR. To conclude, the regionalization of conflict is a danger. We invite all parties to take part in a summit to seek peace in the Great Lakes region.
The Faith International.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Interfaith International expresses its deep concern given the systematic deterioration of the human rights situation in the east of the DRC since the taking of Goma by the M23 and the Rwandan Defense Forces. Indeed, we are concerned at the increased cases of ethnic and racial violence in this conflict, which may turn this into a regional conflict if nothing is done. It is imperative that all parties put an end to hostilities and engage in political dialogue, which is constructive, in order to alleviate the plight of civilians. Given the tragic humanitarian situation, we call for a revitalization of the Luanda process towards an immediate ceasefire. It is time for this session to adopt a firm decision to bring together all the necessary tools to ensure that there is accountability for destabilization in the DRC. And to conclude, we reiterate our support to MONUSCO, in particular in their work to protect civilians. To conclude, we reaffirm our commitment to the preservation of the territorial integrity of the DRC. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to the Center for International Trade. Thank you, Mr. President. CICID welcomes the holding of the special session on the DRC. We demand that human rights violations perpetrated in the east of the DRC cease immediately. These violations result from the Rwandan actions of the Rwandan armed forces and their accomplices of the M23, which have led to systematic pillaging and of the resources of multinational enterprises. An effort must be made to ensure the traceability of commodities from the region and that there be an embargo on the arms trafficking. Sanctions should be handed down against the military officers responsible for these crimes, and there should be full accountability to ensure that justice reigns throughout the nation, upholding the rule of law and a fair due process. We call for an immediate ceasefire to ensure that the Council can undertake investigations to prosecute the main perpetrators of crime and sexual violence perpetrated since the beginning of this crisis. CICID reiterates its commitment to the Rwanda process and to the territorial integrity of the DRC. Thank you.
I give the floor to Amnesty International.
Mr. President, Amnesty International welcomes the holding of this special session. All parties to the conflict in the east of the DRC, including the Rwandan-backed M23 fighters, the Rwandan and Congolese armies, and their allies, must prioritize the protection of civilians in the aftermath of the recent fighting in Goma. Civilians face a grave risk of human rights violations amidst this latest escalation. Over this past year, both sides have ramped up their use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas with devastating consequences for civilians. This must cease. Thousands of Congolese civilians are once again fleeing for their lives in desperate need of safety and humanitarian aid. Amnesty International calls on all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians amidst this devastating violence. The M23, backed by Rwanda, must comply with international humanitarian law. They must ensure the safety of civilians, including human rights defenders and journalists, including those critical of Rwanda and the M23. They must also guarantee safe passage for fleeing civilians and allow and facilitate humanitarian access. We join 75 Congolese, regional, and international human rights organizations in calling for the establishment of an independent mandate to investigate and report on grave rights violations and abuses being committed by all parties to the conflict in eastern DRC, and to support efforts to hold perpetrators to account. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the International Bar Association.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute welcomes this special session of the Council on the situation of human rights in the East DRC. We are gravely concerned at serious human rights violations and abuses and the dire humanitarian situations in Eastern DRC intensified in January this year. In the recent onslaught in which the M23 took control of Goma, CSOs and media have reported killings, rapes, looting, forced labour and forced recruitment. The residents, along with hundreds of thousands of displaced people, have inadequate access to food, water and electricity. Under international humanitarian law, M23 and Rwandan forces have obligations to protect civilians and facilitate access to humanitarian assistance. The Abari urge to establish an independent mandate to investigate, collect, consolidate, preserve and analyse evidence on grave rights violations and abuses being committed by all parties to the conflict in Eastern DRC. Undertake a thorough investigation into all violations and abuses of crimes under international law by all parties to the current conflict. Establish the facts, circumstances and root causes of current violations and abuses, and identify, where possible, those responsible with a view to holding them to account. The creation of an independent mandate to investigate and report on grave rights violations and abuses would send an important message of deterrence to all parties.
Thank you. I give the floor to Fierkat.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, despite repeated alerts by civil society on the deterioration of the security situation in the east of the DRC and its impact on human rights throughout the country, with in particular the lifting of the moratorium on the death penalty and the targeting of human rights defenders and lawyers, the Congolese population continues to be the primary victim of the armed conflict. In less than 2 weeks, over 3,000 were killed and 3,000 were injured. In the city of Goma, over 100 women and children were burnt alive, and an indeterminate number of men were shot to death during a prison break. There were also other abuses reported from other regions. Our organizations have documented cases of enforced disappearance, enforced recruitment, and summary executions involving M23, which has prohibited the activities of civil society and civilian movement in the city of Goma. We fear massive violations of human rights targeting civilian populations on the gender-based or on the basis of professional activities or other characteristics. We ask the Human Rights Council to take all measures in order to ensure the protection of civilians which are imminently threatened by threats of violence, to strengthen mechanisms to protect human rights defenders and lawyers who are threatened, and finally to establish an independent mandate to conduct in-depth inquiries on all violations of international law by all parties to the conflict since the resurgence of M23 at the end of 2021. Thank you.
Floor to International Catholic Child Bureau.
Mr. President, the Catholic Bureau for Childhood and the Congolese organizations members of this network thank this council for holding this special session. On the 27th of January, M23 and Rwanda elements entered Goma. The hostilities in this town of 2 million citizens in addition to the 700 IDPs fleeing conflict, led to 3,000 deaths. Violence was committed and access to drinking water and electricity was compromised, and there are food shortages that are alarming. On the 30th of January, 1,400 schools are still closed. 201 in South Kivu have closed its doors, meaning that 42,000 pupils no longer have access to education. The rebels of the M23 and the Rwandan armies continue to target South Kivu and its capital Bukavu. Our organizations recommend to the Human Rights Council that they immediately dispatch impartial inquiries on human rights violations perpetrated by all parties before, during, and after the taking of Goma, that they foster the recording and the recognition of victims, in particular of sexual violence, that they provide a safe harbor for civilians, and that they create a specific mandate on the DRC for better taking stock of the situation.
Council.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Violations against women in the Democratic Republic of Congo remains a critical issue, particularly in conflict-affected regions. Recent data indicates a significant increase in reported cases of gender-based violence. Between 2021 and 2022, the number of reported cases doubled from 40,000 to over 80,000. In the first 3 months of 2023 alone, over 31,000 cases were reported. Sorry. In the eastern provinces, especially in North Kivu, the situation is dire. A survey conducted by IHRC in April 2024 revealed that 1 in 10 women aged between 20 to 24 had experienced sexual violence in the preceding 5 months. Between January and May 2024, our organizations treated almost 17,363 victims in North Kivu, with 70% of these assaults attributed to armed men. The initiative led to a dramatic reduction in women's experiences of domestic violence from 69% to 29% after 2 years. IHRC calls for accountability through the International Criminal Court, ICC, and other mechanisms.
Thank you. I give the floor to Trial International.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, we join this session to support initiatives aiming to find a response to international crimes that continue to be committed within the framework of the armed conflict in North and South Kivu. In a spirit of complementarity and with respect for national sovereignty, this response should be part of the existing efforts and dynamic of transitional justice and fighting against impunity in DRC. Given our experience on the ground with the Congolese judicial authorities, we would like to draw your attention to the fact that the Congolese justice system has the will and the competence to prosecute international crimes as demonstrated in the past. To preserve these achievements, we call on the Congolese government and their partners to deploy all necessary efforts to ensure that sensitive case documents related